Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. Today we have a very important event, and not only in life of Claudine, but also in life of SCAR as our community, and also in life we just discussed with Professor Rothbart, also in our lives, because it's also a very important part of who we are. So how we will organize the day, the presentation today, we'll give opportunity 40 minutes to Claudine to present her research to us. After that, we will, committee members will give their comments, their questions, and will give opportunity for Claudine to answer these comments to these questions which we have. Then, if we have time, we'll maybe open the floor for some your questions and some your comments. And after that, committee will only 3 people, and we'll ask everyone to leave because we have Al here in computer. We have 1 more committee member here, so for those who do not see. So we will have a discussion, and after that, whatever committee will decide, we will give this information for you in the end. Any question about the procedure? Okay, before we go, as always, we prefer, it's our tradition here at the SCAR, to have introduction who is here now at the table, so we know who people are sitting here around. So I myself, for those who do not know, I am Karina Korostelina. I'm chair of Claudine committee, number 1, this is most important right now, and I'm also professor at SCAR.
So I'm Daniel Rothbart, also a professor at SCAR and member of Claudine's committee, which is my most important task right now.
And we have here also Al Fuertes, who is there in computer, who is also member of the committee.
Sharice Cardenas, alumni and staff member and Claudine's friend, officially. Yeah.
Claudine Garner, I work here also in addition to also a friend of Claudine. Maria Senu, Director of Development, friend of Claudine.
Samantha Porter, shoemaker, PhD candidate, and friend of Claudine.
Angelina Mendez, PhD student here, and I just met Claudine 2 days ago.
2 days ago.
So moral support and to learn.
Daniel McLeod, visiting fiance Claudine.
David Arato, a potential PhD student. I met Claudine, I think 2 weeks ago, and I decided to attend the
Welcome.
I'm Sandra Tombe. I'm a PhD student here. And
I'm Charles Davidson, PhD candidate, member of Claudine's cohort. I aspire to be cool enough to be her friend.
I'm Greg Stanton. I'm a research professor here and also head of genocide watch that would take the genocide issues for a long time.
Hi, I'm Catherine Southwood. I'm a visiting scholar here at SCAR.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. So, Claudine, your time is starting.
Okay. Good morning. First, I would like to thank everybody for being here and spending your Friday morning with me. I know some of you had amazing plans, but thank you for coming. Also, I would like to thank my committee because for the last 3 years we've worked together and you guided me through the whole process. And I would like to thank Professor Korostelina, especially for the last 8 to 10 months after the car accident. You've been really supportive and really supportive, and I really, really appreciate. And finally, I would like to thank Daniel McLeod, who took care of me both physically and emotionally after the car accident and both surgery. And without him, I don't think I'll be here. Okay, so let's start. The idea behind this dissertation came to me about 4 years ago when I was finishing my data for the thesis, and I was talking to a lot of people who went through genocide and mass atrocity, and a lot of them were defining themselves as individuals based on what happened in their own country, based on the narrative in their country, and they were defining themselves based on what their parents went through. and based on the labels they would put in. And that really kind of struck me. I was like, as a person, instead of telling me that you are a successful person, an intelligent person, you're telling me that you are a memory based on what your parents went through. And you are a reflection of what the society said you are supposed to be based on the group you were actually assigned to, or based on the label you are actually assigned to. And I wonder, how is that possible? Especially because a lot of them were not born when the genocide and the atrocity happened. A lot of them were early 20s, and they just don't have any lived experience. But who they are is based on what happened to their people, what happened to their family members. And I was like, there's not enough research done on that, and we need to understand how those young people are seeing themselves in that interesting lens, which can be destructive on the broader scale. And as participant number 41 said, if I'm my father's son and my grandfather's grandson, then I'm nothing more than a memory. My identity was shaped by the lost ones and the lie people tell about my people. And for me, that was really powerful, because he was only 21 years old when we talked. And he's Rwandan, and the Rwandan genocide was 22 or 23 years prior, and he has absolutely no memories. He has no lived experience, but that's how he understands himself. So based on conversation like this and many more, then I wondered, how have the labels of victim and perpetrator shaped the political participation of the new generation of the diaspora communities, especially those communities that went through a mass violence, those we call, those communities that went through something like genocide, ethnic cleansing and things like that. With this question in mind, I started kind of drafting how I would look into this question in this population. And I identified 4 interesting points and concepts that will guide me through the process. The first one is the idea of social identity, the idea of who they are as an individual, but who they are as part of a group, and how that group system influences their values, the way they understand life, and their perception. The second is those labels, victim and perpetrator. What does that mean in the context they're from, but also what does that mean for us, people who are studying and working around peace and around reconciliation? The idea of consciousness, especially for the diaspora community, is really important, because those people, as I said, were born after the genocide. A lot of them were born in a new country. And being part of this new mass of like migration that has an important connection to their homeland, yet they are not home, influence the way they understand themselves and the way they act in the new country. And finally, what type of behaviors and initiatives they actually go through in order to understand themselves, but also in order to influence where they're coming from and where they live. With this question in mind, I really had to go and understand the label of victim and perpetrator. I read and talked to a lot of people, and I think the best way to understand that and to explain it is through that dichotomy of victim and perpetrator, and how both have a really important narrative. And I found that the movies Sleeping Beauty and Maleficent were actually amazing to explain that. In most fairy tales, we always have a victim and we always have a perpetrator. If we take that on a group level, we always have a group that's called the victims and the perpetrators. Those two groups seem to be really opposed. People in those groups seem to be, we perceive them as homogeneous, as having the same characteristic, having done the same thing, and also having the same narrative. In the movie Sleeping Beauty, we have the story of Sleeping Beauty. We have the story around her life, her family, and we don't really know anything about Maleficent other than the fact that she's just evil and she just wants to do bad things. In the movie Maleficent, we actually learn about her past. We learn about what makes her do what she did and the context behind the action she actually ended up taking. With these two movies, we actually have a broader idea of what happened in that specific atrocity. What happened both to the victim and to the perpetrator. And as Maleficent said, a villain is just a victim whose story hasn't been told. And with this in mind, I was wondering then, how can we apply that to today's society? How can we apply that to younger people, or even people who went through mass atrocity? How can we understand who they are by understanding that, yes, they are perpetrator of an action, but there's so much more around them. There's so much more context. And they are the villain of a story, but at one point they saw themselves as victims. How is that portrayed in today's society when we look at violence, when we look at genocide, ethnic cleansing, and things like that? So this is what I had in mind when I was really looking at the perpetrator and the victim narrative and the labels that comes with it. Then I wondered, what are diaspora communities? Why are they so different from other migration and other communities that move to a second or third country? After a conversation with a couple people, I really understood that a lot of people don't necessarily understand what makes diaspora community really important and so powerful. And I felt that I had to really go and explain that to people. What makes diaspora community so unique is the fact that they are conscious of where they are from. That consciousness has defined their identity because their identity is really interconnected to the homeland, to the country and the history of the country. And most importantly, because they lived for so long outside the country, that the image they have of that homeland became almost mythical. The image and the understanding of where they're from is not the same as the country where people are living in today. So they have this really interesting connection to where they're from, and they have a really interesting understanding of that country, which most of the time is not the actual perception of people living in the country. With that in mind, then, I understood that nobody is born diasporic, but people who are actually embodying that diaspora identity do it because they have this hunted history. They have the history of where they're coming from. They have the history of genocide, of mass ethnic cleansing and things like that, which means they feel that there's something that's not quite right because they live in a country, they have created a home for themselves, but that home is not the home they always imagine because they're not home. They are not in that homeland they have actually imagined for so long. And those diaspora community then have self-identified themselves and created a network that connect that homeland to the nation they live in. Then, when it comes to their behaviors, a lot of diaspora community are able to actually be active because they have the means, the education, and they have the actual financial resources that allow them to participate in this country they live in, but also influence the country they're from, their homelands. They have these collective beliefs that they actually can make a difference, either positive or negative. They can make a difference, which gives them the power then a lot of other communities don't have. And because they have these conscious beliefs, a lot of them engage into what I call political participation, which are initiatives and actions the group takes in order to impact their communities and the nation they live in and the nation they actually come from. With all this theory and all this knowledge in mind, I created a model that is divided into three different levels. The first level is looking at identity formation, especially into the connection between homeland and host country. The second level looks at the culture and the cultural differences between the homeland and the host country. And the third level look at their behavior. From understanding the first two levels, they have went through a lot of processes that led them to act a certain way. And this is what the third level looks at. Then I wonder, how am I going to do that research? What type of methodology I'm going to use? And I decided to use the phenomenological research method because that research method actually allows you to go back to the basic. That research method gives you the tools to actually understand and gain knowledge from people's experience and from their understanding of themselves and the processes they went through. And that actually allowed you to create phenomena that looked at similar cases that went through the same types of events. From choosing my methodology, I decided to do 2 cases, Bosnia and Rwanda. I did those 2 cases because we went through civil war and genocide approximately at the same time. Before the genocide, they had international peacekeeping mission, and after the genocide, they had other international initiatives happening in their country. And because they went through the same type of dynamic at the same time, a lot of the second and third generation now have the same age, understand themselves through similar lenses. After that, I decided to divide the participants into 2 groups. The first group are what I call the young people, who are between 18 and 35. A lot of them were born either outside the country, or they were born in this transitional phase where they had to flee and find another place to live. But they identify themselves as Bosnian or as Rwandan. The second group is composed of people who are 36 years old or older, and they're mostly first generation. Those I talked to specify, I really looked at people who were born in the country they're from, in the homeland, because I want them to have gone through the experience of mass violence, but also relocation. So they could actually understand those different dynamics I really want to analyze. And they were aware or belong to a diaspora community. In terms of data collection, in a span of 8 months, between March and September, I collected about 93 different participant interviews. The Bosnian community was coming mostly from 6 different states, and Rwandan from 8 different states. Initially, I really wanted to do in-person or Skype interviews, but because I got into a car accident while I was actually doing research in Texas, I had to kind of change the way I was doing the research. And the car accident was on itself, I think, a new way to collect data, because a lot of people felt like I was being targeted, which made me even more, made the research even more dangerous. So a lot of people decided to either not be interviewed, or they decided to do the interview, but through email. They're like, send us the information you need, and we'll correspond via emails. We don't necessarily want to see you. We don't really want to be in public with you, because you just got hit by a car accident, or just got hit by a car. And the circumstance of the car accident, I think, made a lot of people afraid, because I was not in the car when I got hit. So they felt that I was actually being targeted, which changed a lot of the dynamic after the car accident, which made, I think, the research even more interesting to me, which is sad to say that. So when it comes to results, as I said, I interviewed Bosnian and Rwandan. In the first group, I had 25 people in the Bosnian side and 15 in the second group. In Rwanda, for the Rwandan community, I had 28 in the first group and 25 in the second group. When it comes to how they identify themselves, all those different identity you see is the identity they actually chose when we were talking. I didn't ask them, all these identities are the ones they chose themselves. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. With the data collected, I went back to my model, and I actually identified 3 major themes that corresponded to my model on itself. As I said, the first level is looking at identity through the host and homeland. And the first theme I identified was social identity. The second level in my model was culture. The second theme I identified was cultural integration. And the third, as I said, identity politics and contagious politics. And the way it was translated in the data was social consciousness. All these are all different themes I came up with while I was talking to all those people and kind of transcribing the interview. And as you can see, there were a lot of different themes coming from 93 interviews. And it was really interesting, okay? So when it comes to what they said, on the first level, looking at identity, the Bosnian community identified either as American, Bosnian American, Bosniak, Bosnian Serb or Serb, and Croat. The Rwandan community identified as American, African American, Rwandan American, Rwandan, Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa. Those are the identifications they used while they were talking to me. On the Bosnian side, those who chose to actually be identified with the American identity, they did because that's all they knew. A lot of them were born in America, or they were born in refugee camp or a different country, and they were in the process of coming to the US. So all they knew was really America. They didn't know anything else than the American culture. Those who chose to be identified as Bosnian American did that because it was a safer combination for them, because they were from a country that went pro-genocide, and the Bosnian identity on itself was too heavy to carry, because there were a lot of questions when it comes to, what happened in Bosnia, which group were you in? And a lot of them chose that identity because it was safer, but also because they served in the American military. They went to school in America. And the American identity is important to them, yet they still want to maintain that Bosnian culture. Those who chose to be, also those who chose to use the Bosnian American did so because they were coming from mixed family. One of the parents was Bosniak, the other one was Serb. And they just didn't want to be caught in that tension, that family tension and community tension, their family experience. And it was just safer to be Bosnian American instead of choosing the Bosniak side or the Serb side. Those who chose to be identified with the ethnic identity chose it because it was an affirmation of the journey, the struggle they went through. And in a lot of cases, they really want people to remember what they went through, what the ethnic group went through. And it was a way to reaffirm themselves. On the Rwandan side, the American and African American identity was really influential in the younger population. Like in the Bosnian side, in the Bosnian community, a lot of them, that's all they knew. They were born in refugee camp, or they were born in the US, and they don't necessarily have an actual connection to Rwanda other than the connection their family and their parents still have. A lot of people also choose to use the African American identity because that's the identity that's the most important to them today, especially in the context of what's happening in the US. They were like, being a Black person in the US is hard. And that's how I'm identifying myself, because I identify with the struggle of the African American. And others were like, I'm African and American because I know Africa, because I was born in Africa, but I also have the American citizenship. And those two make who I am. The Rwandan national identity, I think, was really, really interesting to me because for some people it was a political statement. Saying I'm Rwandan, it was for them choosing where their allegiance will be. For a lot of people, they just didn't want to answer the questions around the Rwandan genocide. And they were just like, I'm Rwandan American, or I'm Rwandan, sorry. Also, this identity has caused a lot of problems to a lot of Rwandan people, because living in diaspora and choosing that Rwandan identity has put them in a really interesting position, both in the community and the other community. Some of those who choose that identity express the idea that as a Hutu, choosing to be a Rwandan is being a traitor to their own ethnicity and is being a spy to the other ethnicity. As a Tutsi, choosing that specific identity is the same, is denying the Tutsi experience and glorify the Hutu identity. So they just were having a problem dealing with that Rwandan identity, yet they chose that identity because they were like, we just want to reconcile. We've been through so much that we just want us to reconcile as a country. Finally, those who chose the ethnic identity did it as both a political stand, but also as an affirmation of the ethnic identity. And for them, choosing that ethnic identity was saying, I still remember, and I remember what we went through, and I want people to know that I'm from that specific group. When you choose an identity, you have emotional attachment to that specific identity. And that's something I really wanted to know, why they were choosing that specific identity when they were talking to me. A lot of the Bosnian community express shame, both to either not fit in their own community, shame because they don't feel fully, or shame because of the story and the history of their community. A lot of Rwandan express shame of the historical past Rwanda has and the genocide, but almost nobody expressed shame of being from that specific ethnicity or that specific national identity they chose, which was really interesting to me because those who grew up with that identity of perpetrator, I had expected that they would kind of be feel a little bit tense with that ethnicity. And they were like, I'm not ashamed of who I am. I'm ashamed of what happened in my country and the history of my country, which I think was really powerful, especially for the younger generation, those who are 18, 19, 20 years old. Then, from the different narrative they were talking, I identified 5 narratives: a personal narrative, a group narrative, so a social identity, social group narrative, a historical and genocide narrative, trauma, and then migration narrative. When it comes to the personal narrative, a lot of Bosnians talked about what they went through, about what their family went through, about the fact that they lost family members. Those who talked about the civil war and genocide focused on the Srebrenica genocide. They didn't really talk about the 3-4 years of civil war and all the other things that happened. They really focused on the Srebrenica. And the reason why is because a lot of today's diaspora are diaspora because of that event. They had to flee the country because of that event. And that marked the way they understand themselves and the way they talk about their own communities. Within the Bosnian community, I found a lot of competing narrative between Bosniak and Serb. Bosniak were really talking about their victimhood, while Serb wanted to talk about a more inclusive narrative, talking about how every single person was impacted by the genocide and the civil war. And that often competed when you were talking to one and then going to the other one. You were like, you are talking about the same event, but the way you are talking about it is completely different. And finally, all of them talked about a tough migration process where people, when they were younger, they got bullied, where the system was not necessarily welcoming to immigrants and to people who went through mass violence, and people didn't really understand where they were coming from and what they went through. And that kind of helped create some of the trauma the community experienced. When it comes to Rwandan, I decided to divide into the Tutsi community and the Hutu community because I think they have really interesting narrative when you divide them. The Tutsi community, a lot of them really talked about the Tutsi genocide. That was a really main narrative in the community. A lot of the younger people talked about a building bridge narrative where they tried to actually go and talk to the other community, the other younger people, because they thought that talking to the older people was kind of a waste of time because the older people didn't really necessarily want to engage into something a bit more inclusive. And talking about the competing narrative, a lot of in the Tutsi community really talked about how now that it's been 23 years and that they actually interacted with Hutus, they kind of don't necessarily agree with their own community narrative, which has pushed them away from their own communities, and they face difficulties in their own community because they don't necessarily agree with the narrative the community is trying to promote. In the Rwandan narrative, you had 2 main narratives. One that was talking about the division between the communities, how you have a Tutsi community and a Hutu community, and there's not a lot of interaction. And a lot of them, that doesn't really bother them that much, except those who actually live in those specific community but are not from that community. And then there was an all victim narrative that was really, really important in the Hutu in the Hutu community, because they really wanted people to recognize that they are the victims of the violence too. Going back to Maleficent analogy, they were talking about how all the villains were victims at one point, and they really wanted their sense of victimhood to be recognized. Talking about the historical narrative and the genocide, in the Rwandan community, you have a narrative that talks about the Tutsi genocide, a narrative that talks about the Rwandan genocide, so a more inclusive, a narrative that talks about the RPF atrocity. So there's a strong narrative that talks about President Kagame and all the atrocities they commit before the genocide and after the genocide, especially in the Hutu communities. And then there was, of course, a genocide denial narrative. You have people who deny the fact that a genocide happened. They accept ethnic cleansing and mass violence, but they refuse the label of genocide. When it comes to trauma, Bosnian talked about personal trauma, the fact that they had to go through like 2 schools under one roof type of ideologies, and they experienced war, a war born in the middle of a war. And then they talked about labels and how labels, after 2 decades, are still dominant in the narrative they actually promote in their own community, and how labels has impacted every single level of their own, of the community lives and their own lives. Rwandans also talk about their own personal experience. They also talk about the label and how the label have crystallized the division. And they're talking about how you had division before the genocide, but the division after the genocide are even stronger. And they are hidden because the Rwandan government doesn't necessarily allow a lot of different narrative than their own narrative. And finally, they were talking about a Rwandan political or Rwandan politics trauma that talks about how President Kagame has been the center and the focus of everything in Rwandan communities, both in the Hutu and the Tutsis. In a lot of cases, that's been positive, but in a lot of cases, that's been negative too. So they talk about how the Rwandan politics became a trauma on itself for the communities. And then finally, the narrative of migration. As you can see, Bosnian and Rwandan express the same type of narrative of migration, the resettlement, and how that was really difficult, the legacy of atrocity, the differences between older generation and newer generation. And within the Rwandan community, also talk about how the host country has impacted their migration through discrimination and racial prejudice and stuff like that, because they identify with the African American experience and went through similar experience as African American. When it comes to the second levels, looking at culture and looking at that home country versus homeland, a lot of the participants talked about how you have a clash between tradition and assimilation, how a lot of parents want their kids to kind of know where they're from, know the culture, the languages and things like that. But the younger generation are fully Americanized. They don't necessarily care about where their parents are from, not necessarily care about their own generation or their own community experiences and things like that. They really care about today and moving forward. When it comes to social perspective, same. You have a young, old generation that has been a struggle between the communities. You have a strong ethnic division. For example, you have a big Bosniak community in Massachusetts, but then you have a big big Serb community in Chicago, and those 2 communities don't interact, and they don't necessarily care about interacting. And the same Rwandan, they have the same division. And also you have this idea of the host country has been influential in the way now they understand their own journey and they identify themselves. And finally, when it comes to new opportunities within that new cultural lens, a lot of the younger people have distanced themselves from their own communities because they are seeking new opportunities. They don't want to be pulled back in their ethnic tension, and they just want to focus on today and how to move forward. And most importantly, they want to kind of get away from the burden of the homeland, the burden of the legacy of genocide, and they just don't want to have to deal with that. Finally, the third level that looks at behavior, when it comes to how they actually understand themselves as a group that has some influence in where they live, you have this intergroup cohesion where a lot of the younger generation have tried to unite the community by actually talking to everybody, but a lot of the older generation are really focusing on, this is what happened to us. This is what I want the new generation to understand and focus on. Then you have this, what I call identity politics, where the communities use who they are to actually create an engagement. And for example, I was talking to a Bosnian Serb that talked about how every World Cup, the Bosnian community, the Bosnian Serb community is always like rooting for the Serb community, the Serb group, and not this Bosniak soccer team. They do the opposite. And then when they go back home, they talk about going to Serbia, but they mention Bosnian city. So all those Bosnian cities that are actually in Bosnia, but they have Serbs communities, that's where a lot of people go. But every time they're telling someone, they're like, oh, I'm going to Serbia and not to Bosnia. But those cities are in Bosnia, and they just don't necessarily care about that. And finally, a lot of young people have expressed the idea or the feeling that there is so much social pressure in their own group that it's almost overwhelming to them. Like their group is so trying to control the younger generation that they're actually having some tense feelings about the group, their own groups. When it comes to then, have they been involved and what type of involvement they've been engaged in too, a lot of young generation talk about not being involved because they're from mixed family and they just don't want to be cut in that ethnic division, as I said. The community, their own community are divided and they just don't want to deal with that. Or the labels and legacy of the genocide has just pushed them away from their own group because it's so intense in the group they live in. Those who have decided to be actually involved, they did it because they believe it done never again. They really want to make sure that nothing like that is going to happen again. They did that because they feel responsible for their own communities and they want to educate people in their own communities on what happened, actually not to redo it again. Or they trying to create counter-narrative and promote their own community narrative and their own community voices. They just want to advocate for the community, make sure that the community have the support necessary for them to be able to be part of the global politics and part of the actual initiatives that are happening both in the host country and in their own homelands. What about their country then? How do they see the future of their own country? A lot of them talked about how their country is peaceful in some ways and how they hope that's how the country is going to remain. Other people talked about the status quo and how things won't really change. They're just going to stay the way it is. And finally, a large group has talked about how things are not going to go in the right direction. And the communities and countries are going to go through some other mass violence. Something will happen and they're going to go back to the mass violence because because the country haven't really learned from what happened and they're just hiding it behind closed doors and things like that. So in conclusion, all the communities talked about division, ethnic division, national identity or victimhood division, and transgenerational division. They talked about some type of social pressure, either in the host country they live in or in their own community or home country. And they talk about the label of victim and perpetrator and how that has defined almost every single aspect of their life, from the us versus them narrative to how the different generations understand themselves to how the different generations talk about the history of their own country. For them, those labels of victim and perpetrator have been part of every single aspect of their own community and their own lives. When it comes to recommendation then, first of all, I think the international community and global politics need to understand how their actions are impacting not only the people they actually are directly influencing, but also the newer generation, the people who are going to come later. And that goes back to addressing some of the labels and how 23, 24 years later, the labels that were put together and that were assigned to groups after the atrocity are influencing every single aspect of today's children's life. We need to understand how that is actually happening. Also, we as a community and the international community we need to deconstruct those binary understanding of labels, or those binary labels. By having just a victim and a perpetrator, we are helping the same cycle to repeat decades later, as the younger generation are saying. They're saying that those labels that were created, and the fact that those labels were so rigidly binary, is pushing a lot of new generation to see a pessimistic future for their own country. When it comes to talking to the actual recommendation for the actual communities, honest dialogue needs to happen in communities. Honest dialogue needs to happen. And the diaspora community should be given the opportunities to actually be part of the dialogue that's happening in the community, in the nation, in the state they live in. Because by allowing them to be both civil and politically engaged in their own communities, they are helping the nation and the host country understanding the different narratives that happen in their own homeland and their own communities. Also, inter-community dialogues are necessary for them to be able to humanize the other ones. One of the reasons why a lot of younger people right now are choosing the ethnic and almost a radical narrative is because the other hasn't been humanized. The other one is still the evil, is still the bad person, and they don't have a connection to someone in the other group that can allow them to see the other person as people who went through some type of grievances too. The younger people should be given the opportunities to work through those biases in their own communities. The older generation need to create a safer space for the younger generation to be able to raise criticism, to be able to ask questions, which is one of the things that's missing. A lot of younger generation don't think that their communities are open enough to listen to what they are saying, to listen to them. And finally, the host community needs to understand that diaspora communities have so much knowledge and power. And by understanding that they have so much knowledge and power, they can actually bring them on the table when it comes to talking about initiatives in their own country, or even just doing country profiles, because USIP and all those big organizations do country profiles before doing some type of initiative. And by engaging diaspora communities and people who actually have personal knowledge and have personal lived experience in those countries, they can bring more on the table when we are talking about peacekeeping and peace-building missions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So Dan, would you like start?
Should I start?
Yeah, and then we can ask Al to.
Okay. Thank you very much, Claudine. It's exciting to see your progress over the years into what is obviously a successful dissertation. I just have some questions. I am struck by, of course, your primary focus is narratives, which of course is central for understanding identity and different. And I was struck by the complexity of the narratives. And even though you repeated the theme that the interviewees felt that they were given fixed narratives, but you really scoped down into the sub-themes and so on. And in that regard, it seemed to reveal dimensions of their life. So the narrative was an entry into their life. So let me just suggest that there are multiple frames of their life. You obviously showed political. You showed emotional dimensions, which I want to ask a second question. You showed a sense of community separateness or obviously bonding. Did you feel that one dimension of their life was more prominent than another, like political or social or emotional, or some perspective that they took to their life was more prominent than others?
It depends on the communities.
Okay.
As I said, I went or I interviewed people from 8 different states and about 20 different communities in the Rwandan community and about 6 different states in Bosnia. A lot of the younger Hutu, who they are is political.
Okay.
So the political aspect of what's happening both in the US and in Rwanda is what's the center in their own.
That was their core.
Yes.
Okay.
A lot of the Bosnian Serb, a lot of them was an emotional attachment, especially in the younger generation, because a lot of them don't feel fully Bosniak or fully Bosnian Serb because of the Americanized way of living and the fact that they don't necessarily have the tradition. A lot of them are not necessarily Christian, and they're trying to connect emotionally with their own communities, but still have a strong emotional attachment to America because they serve in the army, because they went to school here and things like that. When it comes to the older generation in the Tutsi community, it's also political because of Rwanda right now, and because we had elections, because politics in Rwanda has become pretty much everything. When it comes to the Bosniak, I think a lot of the interaction is social, because a lot of them are really trying to build a community with the younger generation. They're really trying to educate the younger generation on what happened in their own community, on their culture, on the religion, because a lot of them are Muslims, and they're having that clash between the older generation going to church and going to the mosque, but the younger generation just coming for the actual big holidays. So they're trying to actually create a connection surrounding their community and the social. So I think it really depends on which community and which group, if it's the first group or second group.
Okay. So that really just shows the complexity here. So maybe it's the tone when you say that they're kind of overburdened by these labels of victim and perpetrator. Clearly, it's more complex. And that you're both advocating and doing. In other words, you're advocating that we need to show the complexity here, obviously of multiple dimensions and variations among the communities. So those labels, which some of them feel are imposing or almost oppressive maybe, really it's a little misleading because it's more complicated as you're showing.
For them, the labels have simplified the way the outside world sees them. The labels have taken their own narrative away from themselves.
Right.
I think that's how the labels are actually defining everything, as they were saying, because with a label like victim or a label like perpetrator, who they are as group and as individual has been kind of taken away from them, and they have to kind of respond to the label first before showing who they are.
The label is denigrating. I was also struck and impressed by your discussion of the emotions. These are moral emotions, pride, shame, of course. Just as an aside, it just reminded me also of the German identity, the Holocaust identity, with a number of people who we worked with in the past identify that, Professor Tarikian, is that right? And there's just some parallel to that the even second generation and so on. What were the other emotions? So you emphasized shame and pride as this kind of duality here. There were other emotions, I think, that kind of I didn't notice that you accentuated the other emotions, but they seem to be implied or
I use
carried
shame and
with.
pride because those are the primary emotions they talked about.
They said that.
They are the one mentioning shame and pride, not me.
Okay.
And then when I dig deeper into what they were saying, they talked about confusion a lot. They were like a lot of the new generation were just confused about their community expectations and what their community tell them they're supposed to be. But then America is the land of opportunities, and they're supposed to seek opportunities too. So they're confused, and they're just confused because they don't understand then where to position themselves.
Right.
A lot of people talked about the lust and how they feel lost. How they feel lost as younger generation, especially those who are 19, 20, 21 who are slowly going to college and kind of trying to decide where they're going to go in their own path. Some of the people I talked to, they decide to go into anthropology or conflict resolution. We have a few of them here in conflict resolution because of what they went through. Yes,
Wonderful.
we have.
Apply. Did you tell them to apply?
We have
here?
some here actually.
We have some wonderful, wonderful.
And a lot of people just decided to just put that away, and they were like talking about what they went through and their family went through, just make them empty.
Right.
Also, a feeling of emptiness.
I think that's really exciting. And as you move forward on this in your publications, I just think it would be really valuable to accentuate that more prominently. Again, you did do that with the shame and pride, which is these are very familiar themes with certain externally imposed identity, but even the other emotions. The idea of being lost is really interesting because it taps into the like an ego threat. You're abandoned or whatever else, and obviously it ties in to your other theme about trauma, which has its own history. One last question is the sense. I think you mentioned this to some degree. How variable, how subject to change these identities and these kind of self reflections are. How subject, because we all know identities are always subject to different change, both internally and from external factors that are perceived. So how changeable are these?
A lot of them are really changeable. I talked to some of the Bosniak and Bosnian Serb that talked about how when they were younger, they were just ashamed of saying they're Bosniak. A lot of them were not using their real name. They were using like a pseudonym and things like that. And when they grow older, that's when they were like, listen, I can't change who I am. I can't change my last name. So they slowly start accepting that they were American or Bosnian American and things like that. So their identity changed through time. The same with the Rwandan community. A lot of them talked about how when they were younger, they were just ashamed of saying, I'm from Rwanda, or using the last name. Because Rwandan last name or Bosnian last names are really different than American last names. So a lot of them were mostly ashamed of it and didn't want to use it. But now that they're older, now they actually have some type of connection through dialogue with their own communities or dialogue in their own families, then they slowly start changing how they identify themselves.
And so there's a degree of salience that changes with respect to certain narratives and so on over time.
Yes. And those I talked to, a lot of them, the identity they chose is really salient because when we talk together, they identify like that. That was like the first 5 minutes of the interview, they immediately identify like that because they knew what type of research I was doing. A lot of them had read my previous articles, so they kind of knew why I was doing that type of research. So they actually chose the identity at that moment, and that was the most salient identity to them.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Al, would you like to?
Okay, Claudine, I'm very excited for you. I'm very excited for your study.
Thank you.
Especially the narrative. I'm overly excited about those. I have a few comments and questions.
Okay.
So would you want me to just raise this? What would be the best? I think let me just,
it is up to you. If you want to ask
let
a
me just
question.
express one of these, and then you respond.
Okay.
All at once. Would that be okay?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I have a couple just clarifications or points of curiosity in your methodology.
Okay.
How did you identify who was in diaspora and who was mere immigrant? Because sometimes there's an overlap of these, especially if the context back home is mass genocide or what have you. Sometimes people are forced to quote unquote leave, and then later on they start seeing themselves as immigrants, which that might not be the case first. And then given the challenges that you mentioned earlier in terms of getting your participants and interviewees how did you manage to deal with the IRB consent form for the participant signature? Because this is a very, not a very easy way compared to other, research or studies. Did you get an exemption by the university for this? And then my second one is, with regards to the particularly Rwandan participants, how did you address, and by the way, if some of my comments did not apply, just feel free to say so, okay? How did you manage, especially the Rwandan participants, how did you manage to address your own biases, perhaps, or prejudices, if any, knowing that you, as the proponent and the researcher, is one of them? I mean, also from Rwanda. I mean, I would like to affirm the fact that all of us have our own biases. It's a matter of how we acknowledge or address these. So I'm very curious about that. And then my last comment under methodology is, or maybe part of this is the content is, where are you in the spectrum of all this rich and engaging narrative? I think a part of me wants to hear your voice. I'm just particular to see, and hear your voice in this context. Okay, then I have a couple questions under the narrative portion. Were the people you interviewed, both in diaspora and those immigrants, were you also hearing some nuances about the kind of narratives they had before those tragedies, before those traumatic tragedies, like narratives before the trauma have started? Or did you just purely focus your interviews on the binary approach to this victim offender framework? And perhaps, were you also hearing some nuances about the kind of reality that they would like to wish, or they wish to live in the future? My second question is, how do you make sense when victim and perpetrator roles are embodied by just one community, not necessarily by two separate groups? Were people, were these embedded in their narratives? And my final comment under narrative is, given that people in Rwanda are now encouraged, if not mandated, to view each other as one, all are Rwandans, were you able to gather inclusive and integrative narratives, maybe from those in diaspora or immigrants who may have already gone beyond the stage of us versus them narratives? Because back in Rwanda, and also in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there are emerging inclusive narratives by those who have already gone beyond the stage of victimization and are now wanting to, again, really rebuild, reconstruct, and rehabilitate their country. But I'm not sure if these kinds of narratives are present, with the people in your study. And you mentioned about narratives tend to compete each other. That's really true. And I think from my perspective, sometimes that is because, for one, of the listening ear, the need to be listened to, the need to be heard of in terms of their versions of narrative. That's why they seem to kind of compete against each other. My final comment is in your recommendation. Given the richness of the narrative and how multifaceted and multidimensional they are, and Dan actually highlighted this, I was wondering if you could be more specific when it comes to some of the recommendations you have, in terms of what exactly do people you have interviewed, want to happen in the future, and also from your perspective, instead of just the kind of generic, like, there's got to be a coming together, intergenerational dialogue, and things like that. I wonder if you could be more specific when it comes to the nuances, like, how do these dialogues look like in actual implementation? That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I'm going to answer the question first about the difference between immigrant and diaspora. What I did was I talked to 4 people who are either at ESCAR or around ESCAR, and I asked them their recommendation, what they thought I should do, where I should look, and they actually put me in contact with leaders in diaspora communities all over the US. And then from there, that's where I kind of start getting all the people I was interviewing and things like that. And I also contacted some of my contacts in Europe, and I told them what I was trying to do, and did the same thing. They connected me with either activists or leaders in the diaspora community here in the US. And that's how I got the 93 people I collected. In terms of IOB, I explained what I was trying to do. I explained who I was, my own biases and things like that, and what I was going to attempt to do. And they were like, okay, just make sure that you check with your committee and your chair, and if there's a problem, we'll deal with it at that time. And I was like, okay, then let's do it. Addressing my own biases, I was a little bit, as a Rwandan, as a Hutu myself, I was uncomfortable at the beginning, kind of reaching out to both communities, I have to admit. But I did reach out to both communities, and I reached out to people I actually didn't even know. What I did was, I was part of a political scandal like a year and a half ago, and a lot of people reach out to me through Twitter after my article was published and I had several problems with Rwandan embassy. And I reached back to those people because they had reached out to me, and those people were mostly Tutsi. I was like, you already know who I am. You already know what I'm doing or what I'm trying to do. This is the new research. What do you think? Can you help me? And it happened that 4 of them were actually traveling to the DMV a couple months after I contacted them, and we met and we talked through it. They explained me their own point of view. I explained them who I am and what type of research and my own point of view. And we kind of lay a background on how to deal with the people I'll be interviewing. We kind of talked about how I should approach it when it comes to the Tutsi communities. And I did the same. I talked with Bosnian and Bosnian Serb, and I talked to Hutus, and we did the same thing. And I was lucky enough to actually find one Tukwa, the 3rd tribe in Rwanda. And unfortunately, we couldn't meet after the car accident because of all that was happening, but her and I, we emailed each other, and that's how I was able to get her voice too. So I really tried to be comfortable with everybody else's narrative and everybody else's voice. I told them who I was. I sent them my article, and they were already aware of who I was and what I was writing and how I was looking at things. So we had long conversation before me putting the recorder and taping the conversation. So that's how I'm trying to address some of my biases, but also understand where they were coming from and what they were trying to tell me before talking about the subject and interviewing them. And where my voice is in the presentation itself, because it's only max 40 minutes, I really had to narrow down. But one of the chapter in the dissertation talks about my own voice. I think it's chapter 8 or chapter 7. Thank you. That really talk about how I positioned myself, how I understand what was happening around me, how I contacted people, and how we are connected. And I think that's where my voice was in this project. I really wanted to present more than what I did today, but I had so much content in 93 interviews that I just couldn't present everything in this amount of time. Honestly, at the beginning, I had about 67 slides, and I had to cut down to 43. And then she was like, that is too much. You just can't do all this. So I really had to select what type of information I'll be presenting and what type of information I will be giving to everybody. When it comes to narrative before trauma, a lot of people did
talk about themselves before the genocide or before the atrocities. A lot of people were emotional about it. I think this is one of the reasons why I really didn't try to get deep into those different narratives, because at the end we were all crying and I haven't even started recording. So I was like, let's really focus on what I'm attempting to do now, but I still gave them space to talk about who they are and talk about all those different narratives that are around them. And for example, in the dissertation, I did mention how one of the person I talked to mentioned that she moved to the US way after the genocide. And one of the reasons why she moved was because she's a Tutsi and she's married to a Hutu. And she felt that she was not safe in Rwanda, and she didn't want to have a child and raise her child in Rwanda because of all those things that were happening. And she talked about her family issues with her being married to a Hutu, and how despite the fact that Rwanda is promoting an all Rwandan narrative, ethnicity is still very present in her life, in her family life, in her community life. And she really talked about all those different narratives that influenced her decision to move to the US and her decision to have the life she's living now. Like, she lives here in the US with her little boy who was born here in the US, but her husband's back in Rwanda. And her husband has never seen her kids, or his kids, because he was not allowed to come, and he probably will never be allowed to actually leave the country either. So a lot of people did mention other narrative than the narrative I really focused on in the dissertation. And I wrote some of those narratives, but I really focused on what narrative is actually important within the discussion itself. In terms of reality for the future, it is true that what I pointed is really like political and social within the Rwandans, especially with the lens of we're all Rwandans and things like that. A lot of them talks about a future here in the US and not necessarily a future back home. But they do acknowledge that the future back home is not positive, or won't be positive, because things are so hidden and things are like hush-hush in both, in mostly Rwanda, but also in Bosnia, that their future is the opportunities here. And a lot of them don't necessarily see themselves going back home, which is normal when it comes to diaspora communities. A lot of them dream about the homeland and how to change the homeland, but they don't necessarily want to go back because they have a life here and their situation here is better. The victim perpetrator narrative and how I make sense of it is that all of them talked about how the labels influence the narrative itself. A lot of them talk about, especially in the young generation, they talk about a unified narrative where the victim and perpetrator will come together and create something. Some have started trying to bridge those two narratives, but because the community are so separated, and that's the thing with diaspora, you choose where to live. You don't have to live next to someone you don't want to, but in their own country, they kind of have to. So because of the way the community choose to kind of be together based on their ethnic identity and things like that, those narratives are really, really present. That victim and perpetrator narrative are really, really present in the communities and in the older generation. The younger generation have tried to address this narrative, but a lot of them have given up because they just don't want to get into the politics of their own community, and they don't want to be caught in it because they're still young. They just want to create a future for themselves, and they want to have some type of a better future than their parents. So that narrative of victim and perpetrator is there, and they identified it as being not positive, especially with the new generation. And also being like, it's like a safety net for the older generation. As I mentioned in the dissertation, a lot of people, or some people, chose to hold on to that narrative because it was a way for them to kind of deal with the trauma of what they went through. They were like, we've been through so much, and that narrative is a reflection of the journey itself, and I'm going to hold on to it because that was my journey. And that's mostly in the older generation than the younger generation. The inclusive narrative happen mostly in the younger generation. You have, as you mentioned, you have a narrative of all Rwandan in Rwanda, which I saw here in the US, especially among the Tutsi communities. That narrative is really present when you talk to people, but when you actually talk to the people behind closed door, the narrative changes. And that's something I realized after a full 5-hour interview or after like follow-up interviews and things like that. At the beginning, everybody was talking about how you have that all Rwandan narrative. But then when you talk to them, both on the Hutu and the Tutsi, when you talk to them, the narrative changes. They talk about how ethnicity, despite the all Rwandan narrative, is still the law of the land in their own communities. And a lot of Hutus who live in dominant Rwandan, dominant Tutsi narrative, like in southbound Indiana, a lot of them talk about how the narrative is oppressing. Like as Hutu living in a Tutsi environment where all Rwandan should be the law of land is not the way it is. It's definitely not the way it is. And that kind of gave me a good sense of how inclusive the community and the narrative are behind closed door, which I think that was the most important thing for me. I really wanted to look at what the actual community are saying among themselves and how they experience and how they live their life, and not what they're saying to someone who's just gonna come for like an hour and talk to them and be like, hey, bye, I'm done. And in terms of specificity for the recommendation, I was talking to some of the activists, and I went to several of the conversations with them, and they talked about how they have so much knowledge, but even their own community, they don't necessarily listen to them. So they ended up working with other Rwandan community outside their own communities, or other just communities, like refugee communities and stuff like that. And a lot of them, some of the recommendation they're giving is to actually have a platform in their own community as young people to come and talk about what's happening in Rwanda, what's happening with the elections, how they felt about it as the new generation who's going to take over and hopefully create a better space both in diaspora and in Rwanda. They want to have the opportunity to do that in their own communities instead of doing that in other communities. They want to be able to be the one who not necessarily matter, but influence the politics. One of the person talked about the opposition party here that's based here in DC, and how it's mostly old people, older generation, I should say, and how a lot of them were at one point related to President Kagame, and how they are the one influencing thing now. And they're like, that first doesn't make sense because they are the older generation, and second, they're opposition because they were forced into the opposition by the president, and not necessarily because they are representing the people. They're just representing their own interests. So a lot of the younger people and the younger activists have recommendation. They just need to be heard by their own communities and also by where they live, states and the host country.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Al. So, Claudine, it's such a pleasure, starting with seeing how you're growing as a researcher, how you're growing as a scholar for all this 5 years, starting with your master thesis, and then going into your dissertation. It's really been a pleasure to see your growth and how you become from the student a colleague. It's a very pleasant, right? Then always to see it. And by the way, for those who will defend dissertation soon, look how it should look like. I have several questions. How do you prefer? You had two models, one from Dan, one from Al. Do you prefer question by question or all together?
Yeah, let's do question by question.
Okay. So first group of questions, like two of them, but interconnected on diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
Diasporic communities always used to be, especially older part of it, used to be very militant.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of diasporic studies show that some part of the history play very important role, and it's what was your experience with these both communities? What is the most important for their collective consciousness? Is it past, how they see it in the past, or what's currently going in the country? What really influences them more? Or maybe it's some balance. And connected with it, if we speak, you really stress this cohesion, this sense of kinship within this community versus just immigrant communities. And you wrote in your dissertation about self-efficacy. What really influences self-efficacy of these diasporic communities?
For the first question, I think the older generation focus on the past. They really focus on what they went through. They focus on how the country was before the atrocities and how they were either oppressed by the regime or how they were part of a better system that was destroyed by the genocide or the mass atrocity. The younger generation focus on the present and the actual current situation in the country. But when I was talking to the Bosnian and Rwandan younger generation, they were focusing on how the education system back home is not really working. The political system on itself is just chaotic. How, for example, President Kagame shouldn't have been elected. At that time, most of them were like, I hope he's not going to get elected. We know he will be elected, but maybe a miracle is going to happen and he won't get elected. And those I talked to after he got elected, they were disappointed. I talked to several people before and after, and a lot of them had changed the way they understand themselves and the way they understand the community and the homeland because he got elected on itself. So the younger generation are really focusing on what is happening now, what can we do, and the older generation is focusing on what happened in the past and how the younger generation doesn't understand them, doesn't understand the culture, doesn't want to really speak the language, and how everybody's so disconnected that the other one that really hold the grail because they understand and went through it, which I think is really, really interesting. And that's where the generational gap is really happening because they are connecting the ideal to the homeland based on very different time frame and very different events. When it comes to self-efficiency, I think a lot of the younger people have chosen to either distance themselves and not caring other than just going for the holidays and things like that, or have becoming militants. Like a lot of young people have come together from all over the US and create association or create organization where they'll be meeting once a year or twice a year, creating curriculum. I'm actually working with one of them to actually create a curriculum on identity and political participation. And a younger generation have understood that the way to change is by coming together and by creating something. I attended a wedding in Texas the day before getting hit by a car, and a lot of people were coming from all over the US. Like, I was the only random person who didn't know anyone there, but everybody else, they knew each other. And I was like, where are you from? They're like, I'm from Massachusetts. And the wedding was in Texas. Someone else was like, I'm from Tennessee, I'm from Utah, I'm from all over the US, and they're all coming together because one person in that wedding had told all of them about that, and they wanted to be a Rwandan wedding where the person will have the traditional outfit and the traditional things. And a lot of those young people understood that power comes from numbers, and power comes from the consciousness and the belief that if they come together, they can actually do something. And I think that was really powerful. And I hope I kind of trying to portray that in the dissertation when I was talking that younger generation right now have the education. A lot of them have the tools and the means to do something. And most importantly, they don't necessarily have the experience and lived legacy of that genocide. What they have is how the legacy is influencing their communities and is influencing themselves and their parents and all those older generation, but they understand how to hopefully make it better by doing in numbers.
Wonderful. So my second question is about your case analysis, because I know in your presentation, again, because of the time frame, you concentrated on complexities of narratives, but you also did a lot of cross-case analysis and finding specific tendencies. And because you really concentrated on this impact of labels of perpetrator and victims, what did you find the difference in political participation between groups who were assigned the label of perpetrator and group assigned the label of victim?
Those who were assigned the victim label, their political participation became within their own communities by creating educational system for the younger generation, by doing cultural initiatives such as dance and tradition and things like that. It became really inward and how to help their own community maintain that narrative. And some of them went out of their community into the bigger community where they live in by educating people on what happened to them. Those who actually got the perpetrator label, their sense of action became really a political action. It became, this is the situation back home. This is how people are talking about ourselves, about our community, about me, my parents, and things like that. And this is where I don't agree with them. Because I don't agree with them, I'm going to go out and talk to people about it. I'm going to go to school and explain people about the complexity of the narrative. I'm going to engage in movement and political action that are happening both here in the US, but also back home. I'm going to send money, or I'm going to send money to initiative and support things that will be influential in the bigger lobbying system that's happening in Capitol Hill or that's happening back home and things like that. So they both had some sense of activism and political participation, but they were directed toward outsider for those who were seen as perpetrator and to insider for those who were seen as victims.
I think this is very important, especially when you're writing now this your book proposal. I think this is was very, very important point to stress. And if you speak about these victims who try to actually preserve narrative and make it cemented within the community and make it as a center for the community identity, while those who have this label of perpetrators, it's try to destabilize the narrative. And they try not only destabilize it for the inside, but they also try to destroy this label for outsiders. I think this is one of the very important message which should be in your book. Very, very important message. And my third question is about the, similar to Alva's asking what to do, right? First we discuss what is wrong and then what to do, usual Russian questions. I'm just telling Russian questions. There's a very famous Russian philosopher who was telling that there are two questions in the Russian soul: who is guilty and what to do about it. So what is here is you speaking about this lost people, right? You were speaking about this confused, lost people. And the one thing which is coming into mind is the whole idea of Nietzsche that you become free, you really acquire your freedom, then you deal with the history. Then you take control over history, you take control over these narratives, values, social settings which come from the history, which impact you, and then you take control over it. Similar with I was thinking about right now about Fromm, who actually told that people who experience a lot of trauma, they have to deal with it by making sense of it. They don't want to let it go. If you suffer, you don't want to tell, oh, I just suffer for nothing, I want to forget about it. I suffer for the reason that I came with something else. The suffering have a meaning for me and help me to become somebody. That's why the people who suffer sometimes hold into it and they try to push the suffering on the next generation because it's who they are. They don't want to believe that suffering was for nothing. right? So if you think about this ideas what to do about it, how to help people, this older generation who try to impose this meaning of suffering on the new generation, at the same time the younger generation who need to get rid of this impact of history, and you speak about this civic engagement and civic activism, I think something should be really very thoughtful recommendations, more specific recommendation. I know it's very hard, but maybe for future you can think about it, maybe part of your next work. How to work with this diasporic youth who are educated in American systems. They learn about civic engagement, civic responsibility, and all of that. But how help them to transfer this knowledge into dealing with past of genocide? So I think this also can be your future, part of your future work for this.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. I did ask one of the participants how she deals with being from a country that have a genocide and being kind of in that transitional, she's not a young person anymore, but she's not necessarily an old person, how she deals with both narrative. And what she said was the older generation is lost to the cause. A lot of the older generation are so focusing on what happened that they can't see what could potentially become. That's what she said. And she said the focus now needs to be on the younger person, on the younger people, and how by educating them at looking at inclusiveness and inclusive narrative and actually looking at the country they're from, not as labeled as victim of perpetrator, but as a country that went through something, and everybody at one point experienced some of the trauma from that. By explaining those young generation how to deal with that, then we can move forward. And we saw like a week ago how young people can be powerful in influencing so many changes. So I do agree with her. A lot of recommendation and measure needs to kind of focus on the younger generation because they are the one that hopefully will become the next leader and hopefully will become the next peace builder, peacekeeper in their own community, but also back home. So I do agree that we kind of need to tackle then where are we going from here. We have the data from these two communities, but how can you actually help them see what the future can look like?
And I know that you're capable to really understand the whole complexity of it, because then you tell people don't speak about the past. It's mean because for them speaking about the past connected with justice, right? So it's a search for justice which keeps them getting back to the past. So, but it's again, if you just stuck in the past, you could not build something new. So how to unite this develop of inclusiveness together with still creating justice, together with, because what's going on now, for example, in Germany, if you observe it, like this constant long time, and what was very important for Germany to understand, we perpetrators, this is what we done. But now young generation come in and protesting and telling, we didn't do anything, why we still have to accept this narrative for perpetrator? We are not perpetrators. So I think this is very, very problematic area which you have a lot of time and opportunities to work on in the future. Okay, we can have maybe one or two questions or suggestions or ideas. Anyone? Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you. This was a wonderful presentation. So you talked a little bit about how you were able to get like Rwandan and Bosnian communities before you started your data collection, like identifying who you'll interview and all of that. My question is to you as an outsider for the Bosnian community, how were you able to approach that? Like how long did it take you before, I don't know, building trust, for example, for people to be open and willing to speak to you? And do you feel like, as a Rwandan, did that make it necessarily easier for you to interview the Rwandan community? And then if I could tag a second question to that is, you talked about recommendations that, that communities need to come together, they need to, have a dialogue and open engagement. My question to you is, do you think you have the opportunity to share the findings of your research with the Bosnian community that you've interviewed, the Rwandans you've talked to? and how are you going about potentially sharing what you've found from your analysis?
Do we have any more questions from the group? Yes, please.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm impressed with your presentation. I hope I'm able to learn from you. Mine is 2 observations, but you may have to probably shed some little light on it. The third committee member asks a question on your bias. How do you handle your bias? I've had the opportunity of interacting with 1 or 2 Rwandese, and my observation is that they seem, I may be wrong, they seem to have some solid stance. You speak to what this one, he tells you what this one says is not correct. You speak to that, you speak with the other fellow, he tells you what this one says is not correct. So there's the potential of also the respondent's bias, not you, the researcher. So I don't know whether you observed any of such, and how did you address some of these potential biases that may influence the narrative or their perceptions. Now, my second observation is this. I reckon from your presentation that there was some overlap between the groups of people, I mean the elderly groups and then the younger groups that you interviewed. And there were some differences. What do you think is accounting for this overlap and differences? For example, is it the case that probably the narratives or the perceptions of the younger group was shaped to a large extent by the older group? Or is it the case that by virtue of the younger group having access to now a lot of information, their perception or their narrative is being shaped more on their studies or the internet or whatever information they are having, or probably their visits to the host countries? Did you notice, were you able to identify what is accounting for the overlaps and the differences in the narratives of the perceptions of the different groups?
Okay, thank you.
Sandra, in terms of approaching the communities, it was definitely not easier to approach Rwandans because Rwandans, we have a problem of trust. We do not trust each other. As the person talking about the Rwandan identity said, going to his community and telling his community I'm Rwandan caused him problems because they saw him as a traitor to his ethnicity. When he went to the Tutsi community was like, yeah, you're trying to spy on us. So it was definitely not easier to address and go to the Rwandan communities. It was a little bit easier for the Hutu community because they had read my article and they had questions about it. So I went in through a huge interrogation before being able to say anything related to my research. They had a list of questions I had to address first. When it comes to the Bosnian community, the fact that I had already insider helped a little bit. But in order for them to feel comfortable with me, we also had to have conversation. I had to open up about who I am, about the fact that I'm from Rwanda, and as Bosnian and as aware as what happened and genocide and things like that, they also had questions. So in order for them to open up, I had to open up and tell them a little bit about myself, a little bit about my background and things like that, which helped them because they could connect with my own experience. I was not an outsider telling them, hey, I want you to tell me about genocide. I want you to tell me about the worst thing that happened in your life. I was, in a way, an insider because I was like, what happened to you happened to me. This is how I understood it. This is how I lived it. What about you? And at that time, we could actually engage into a conversation and not into an interview. So a lot of the interview I had were actually conversation where I knew all my questions, so I didn't have to read or anything. And I asked them.
And it helps, right?
Yes, it does.
I know I torture you.
And I knew the order, but I had a lot of sub-questions based on what they were telling me. So we ended up having a good hour, almost 2 hours sometimes, because we actually engage into a conversation as two people going through two people who went through similar things and can actually relate to the other person, okay? In terms of your second question, I'm sorry, I don't remember it.
Is there a possibility that you can share the findings of your research with?
Yes, I
these two communities?
actually have a few people waiting for me to send it to them. They're like, listen, we know it's 300 and some pages, we need to see it. They are not saying that because they think I wrote something wrong, because I kind of went back sometimes when I had questions. I was like, hey, this is what I'm writing. Do you think is actually portraying what you told me? It's more like a lot of them are actually happy that someone listened to them and their story, and not necessarily went and asked them about what happened in Bosnia and Rwanda. How did they escape? What route they take, or whatever. It was really, who are you? How do you understand your position today? How do you understand your community? How do you see and understand what happened, and how is that impacting you? How do you understand that label, victim perpetrator? Which label do you feel like is the one that portraying your own experience? So we talked about them today in today's current circumstances and not the past. I think that made it easier for them, and that made them want to read the whole thing, which I feel sorry for them because it's long. Question about biases and how to address the respondent biases. The methodology on itself allow me to actually understand that it might be their biases, but it's their experience. I can't tell someone what their experience is. I can't deny what they went through. I can't deny their perception. So what we might see as their biases, for them, it's their lived experience. It's because of the lived experience, that's how they created maybe those biases. So that is knowledge on itself. And by talking to as many people as possible and kind of connecting all those experiences, you can start picking up what is the common thread through all those things. You can pick up why that person said this and why this person said this. And that's the beauty behind understanding at the basic level what the idea of perpetrator and victim and how those two narratives are competing based on how we as a society has defined it, but they are interconnected in people's life. Like if you talk to someone today and that person say, I was labeled perpetrator, and talk to someone else who was labeled victim, and actually talk to them about exactly the same experience, they will have a lot of commonality. A lot of those two people will see themselves as victims, despite all those labels and all those biases. I think by having that conversation and understanding where they're coming from based on the narrative they're telling you and based on what everybody else in the same situation is saying, you can understand how to deal with all those. And overlapping and differences in experiences, I think the older generation, their experience is based on the atrocity and the migration processes and how tough things were for them. A lot of the younger people, the experience is based on how they had to kind of understand the new culture and adjust to the new culture, but still go home and be expected to act like a true Bosniak or a true Rwandan. And they also experience is based on the fact that a lot of them don't have second parents. A lot of them don't have grandparents to go through. So they have a lot of overlapping experience because they have common trauma, because they have common lived experience based on what they are missing in their life and what stories the family are telling. And also based on the fact that a lot of the younger generation have lived and they are telling the older generation have lived the atrocity and are telling the new generation. But the new generation have, as you mentioned, the media. They have history and things like that, but they also have the opportunity to know at least one person from the other ethnicity. They have the opportunity to know another person who went through mass atrocities, because the Rwandan genocide, the Bosnian genocide was 20-some years ago. You had Sudan after that. You had a lot of other mass atrocities that happened, and a lot of people relocated in this country, which means you have a larger pool of people who went through a lot of things. So they have this opportunity, because they're open-minded enough and because they're seeking the information, they have this opportunity to not only understand their own narrative and their family narrative, but other people's narrative, which allow them to have that differences from the older generation and have that drive to hopefully create something better, because we have some here at ESCA studying conflict resolution, or other schools study conflict resolution.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is the time for committee to discuss. We would kindly ask everyone to leave the room because we could not leave. Al is here with computer. Very careful consideration, very long deliberation. We as a committee decided, make a decision to award doctorate.